Hello, chess family. It's me, National Master Jesse James again. And today we're going to be looking again at the Halloween's Gambit. We're going to be looking at a cool idea in the Halloween's Gambit for white to attack for black's best defense at playing pawn to d5. Let's go ahead and jump in and take a look. So here we go. We start up with d4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6, starting with, of course, the four knights opening. And here, trick or treat, here we go. Knight takes on e5. Again, not the best gambit ever, but it is a very fun one if you like to attack. If you want to be a very good attacker, you have to be a very good endgame player. It may sound a little strange, but a lot of times when you get into a very good attack, your opponent is going to try their best to defend. And sometimes when they make that defense, they have to give away lots of material. So most of the time, you're going to be going into these endgames against strong players. If you know about Tal, then you should know that he is actually a very, very strong endgame player, because not all attacks will end with your attack of checkmating the king. Most of the time you're going to be winning material and just going into a favorable endgame. So this is one of the ideas with that. Here we go. Knight takes e5, of course, winning the piece. And now let's go and start pushing our opponent's pieces back. Go ahead and use your pawns to do this, of course. Pawn to d4, knight goes to g6. Remember, if you play this knight to c6 idea, white gets a very strong plan of after d5, knight e5, f4, knight g6, e5, oh my god, knight g8, and then d6. Here after this, white gets a really good game. And this is the main line for black in these knight c6 lines. This is why knight c6 does not get played. Of course, if you're looking at playing the other line, which is playing the knight to g4, this goes into white just having a slight advantage after e5, winning the piece back right away. So the best way for black to play this is knight to g6. And let's keep pushing these knights back, getting free tempos with our pawns. Hopefully you see it. Pawn to e5. Knight jumps back to g8. Here, we have to remember the concept of attacking the weakest pawn next to your opponent's king, which is the f7 pawn. So we're just going to try and set up for Scholar's Mate here. Bishop c4. And the best defense to this is for black to play the refutation line, pawn to d5. Here, black gives back the pawn, but gives the pawn a way to get his pieces a little bit more active. And he's going to try and set up a light square defense on e6, d5, and f5. The best way for white to take is to go ahead and take with the bishop. And black sets up the light square defense by playing pawn to c6. The bishop retreats back to b3. Remember, guys, it's always a good idea to keep your bishop where it's always going to be defended. If you put it back to c4, it's being unprotected, so it could become a target. And here, black, I believe, in my opinion, plays a little bit inaccurately here. I like the main line of black playing bishop b4, looking to make trades right away and get rid of this dark square bishop, which is typically not a good piece. In this game, you're going to see it not do too well either. Due to white's pawn structure, which is all on the dark squares, taking away this dark square's diagonals. So here black plays bishop e6, and the reason why I don't think this is the best move is because it allows white to throw the knight to e4, where it's going to be very good. And again, you don't get this trade of the bishop. Well, black has a different idea in mind. Black tries this queen h4 idea. Oh, I'm sorry. White goes ahead and castles real quick. And black tries this interesting idea of playing queen h4. Now, I do understand this idea. I can't say it's the best. With queen h4, I think there's a lot of things that can go bad here for black. You can push your pawns up, get some free tempos on the queen, maybe even get this pawn storm going over here. The other thing is, the queen can become a target, as we're going to see in this game. But I understand why black played this. Black brings the queen over here, which kind of makes sense to put some harassment on the king. But also the main thing was to try and castle queenside. As we see in some of the other variations, it's not a bad idea. Unfortunately here, white was able to take full advantage of this. So white goes ahead and plays a very interesting idea. Remember, the best square for this knight is to go to e4. How do we achieve that? Here, white goes ahead and plays pawn to f3. One of the nice things about bringing your knight to e4, hopefully you're thinking ahead, is to develop with another threat, which is bishop going to g5, right? With the knight on e4, it's already preparing this. It's actually kind of saying, hey, you might want to be careful with castling, as the rook on d8 will then be forked with the king, and with the rook and the queen. So a lot of already problems that black is getting with just some very simple moves here for white. Well, black goes ahead and keeps up with it. He's going to go ahead and castle. And white plays the knight to e4, threatening bishop g5, harassing the queen, harassing this rook. So black plays a nice simple move of just bishop to e7, developing and defending against this g5 square. Here, if you're looking at lines about taking on e6, You're more than welcome to. I don't recommend it. White is really hoping that black will end up snack attacking on b3, and here you'll just capture back toward the center and have this open file for your rook. Remember, white is hoping to actually create an attack against the king on the queen side over here, so he really wants to allow open files to be made. For right now, though, he's just going to go ahead and keep the game solid. He plays pawn to c3 here, just holding down the d4 pawn as well. This square did become a little bit weak. And black goes ahead and plays knight to h6. Yeah, again, not one of my favorite moves here for the knight. A knight on the rim is grim. I guess maybe black was hoping for the knight to jump to f5 and I guess try to become active over here. Well, what should white do now? I really like the way that white plays this game. White just says, you know what? I have a really strong center. I have my pieces very well developed. My knight in the center is definitely the best piece on the board. Let's head to endgame, and he plays queen to e1. Now, this may seem like a very strange move to trade whenever you're down in material, but again, with this pawn structure and a simple plan for white of pushing their pawns forward, white has a very good strategy here. If you want to be a good attacker, you must be a very good endgame player. So, well, why wouldn't black trade? Black goes ahead and just takes back. And then black plays king to b8. A very slow move here. Allowing white a nice trade here. If you're playing white, what would you play here? Here, white goes ahead and plays bishop takes h6. Now, some people may not like this move because it's going to give away the bishop pair. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, this bishop is not going to be doing too much just because this bishop is not going to be doing too much. Why? Because the pawn structure is all in the dark squares. Here, white might even want to play f4 in the future, making this bishop just sheltered in, right? There wouldn't be too big a difference between this bishop and a pawn over here, as it's controlling about as many squares as it. So after we trade here on h6, pawn takes back. Now you've messed up your opponent's pawn structure, and you also have created some weak squares around the king side over here. And white just keeps strengthening their position, just playing to make the best positional moves here. Rook a to d1. Black goes ahead and makes the trade, and we're going to just take back here. This is probably one of the best times for black to make this trade, although maybe it was best not to take and hold on to that bishop. White's double pawns here are actually very nice for them, as I said before. Always take back toward the center, and sure you might be playing something like b4 to control the c5 square, and just have more central presence. The rook really won't do too much on the a file anymore since this is endgame, because black can just play the simple a6 move, and well, it's no longer a target because this is endgame. In the endgame, we should be trying to make a passed pawn. And here, we're going to be seeing white do that quite easily because, well, white has a very strong pawn center here, right? Black's pawn structure is definitely messed up, and he's only got 1-2 pawns that can try to stop it. Black goes ahead and plays, interesting, he plays rook to d5. Why was rook d5 played? Rook d5 was played to try and play like something like c5 in the future and try to make a d4 pawn weakness, or maybe even the e5 pawn weakness. Because of that, white just plays a simple move. How do we stop c5 from being played? Simple chess we're just going to play. Pawn b4. This pawn was undefended, so we're going to push it up one square, controlling the c5 square. Black continues with this idea. He goes ahead and plays rook to d8. Hopefully you see black's threat. Don't lose a pawn. Here, black is just threatening the simple knight takes e5 here due to the pin. So white goes ahead and plays rook a1. Now this is a very nice move. Not only does it move the rook out of the pin, but it also maybe even says, you know what, maybe I'll play rook a5 to get the rook active over here. Of course, if you trade, you're just helping out my pawn structure. Well, black continues with something like h5, and I love the way white does it here. White's ready to start making advancements. Where do you play for the advantage? Should you push your kingside pawns? Should you try to push in the center? Or should you try to go queenside? Whenever I try to make my plans, I always consider all three of these quadrants, the center, the king side, or the queen side. I look where I have the best potential, and that's where I'm going to push at. Here I think white made the best decision here and played pawn g3 with the very nice easy plan of playing f4, f5. Notice that once you get these pawns rolling, your king can jump in behind it. Black has a very hard time creating counterplay. So white's job's very easy. Let's just push these kingside pawns and make slow advancement. Because white has no real weaknesses, what does black do? Black has a very hard time trying to provoke them. So as long as white's just playing nice and steady, like my favorite player Petrosian, it should be a very easy game here for white. Black plays h4. Of course, if we take, well, it's just going to mess up our pawn structure. So simple chess. Let's keep advancing on the king side. Pawn to f4. You can see f5 is not too far away anymore. Pawn takes, Rook g8 with the simple threat of knight takes on f4. What do we play here? This is a plan we were already wanting to play. We're just getting extra tempo for it. Or a free move. King f2. Our king's just going to come up right behind these pawns and help escort these pawns across the board. Already, computer's giving this as an equal position. Although when I say equal, I'm doing the top 5 moves for this game. The top 3 moves are giving equality, and then the next 2 are giving white a +1 advantage. So when it says something like that, where it's only giving them an equality for the top 3 moves, and the next 2 moves are going to be giving white the advantage, that means it's an advantage for white, especially because you're not a computer and you're going to be making mistakes. Pawn a6 gets played, again, just kind of waiting around. And now let's just keep making progress. What do you play next here? There's 2 good moves I would play here. You could just give me one. Hopefully you saw the text move, which was f5 to keep pushing forward. Another way to look at this would be something like rook h1, just putting pressure on the h pawn, which is undefended, and is an isolated pawn. Both these moves, I think, are splendid. Here, f5 got played. Black goes ahead and plays the knight back to f8. Obviously, things are not going well here for black, and white just keeps making progress. Rook e to d1. Why was this move played? Can you tell me why? Remember, every time your opponent makes a move, ask yourself, what is my opponent's threat? Hopefully you figured it out. White wants to start pushing these pawns forward and play c4 to attack the rook, so all they're doing right now is protecting the d pawn for whenever that does happen. Black sees the threat and plays the rook back to d7. Now, if we could play c4 here, but we don't get the tempo anymore because, well, the bishop can take on b4. So, simple chess. Let's just keep making progress. White goes ahead and plays pawn f6, attacking the bishop. Notice the bishop now has to retreat to d8. And now we couldn't look about playing c4 here because the bishop's going to have to retreat and will no longer attack the b4 pawn. Bishop to d8 here. And I love this move, knight c5. The knight just keeps grabbing better and better squares and also gets tempos off this rook. In fact, you can't even move your rook to d5 here because, well, c4 will just trap the rook. And black will have to give up the rook for the knight. So the rook is forced back even further. Rook to c7, ew. Let's keep making advancements here. White's all over the board right here. Black might have an idea about playing knight to e6 to make a trade here. How do we stop that threat and improve our pieces? Simple chess, hopefully you found it. Rook goes to h1, attacking the h7 pawn. Why is this important? Well, now if the knight does try to jump to e6, we're simply just going to go ahead and take. Now we're going to be having the possibility of having 2 passed pawns over here. Oof. Getting worse and worse. Notice how it's so easy for white to play here because, again, they have no weaknesses and they can slowly push forward. Black, on the other hand, again, white has no weaknesses in this position, so it's very hard to attack. Black is actually looking for one idea in particular. He wants to trade either the knight or a bishop for some pawns over here. 2, if he can get 3 pawns, that would be best. So white does have to be on the lookout for a counter sacrifice in that kind of position. Black goes ahead and plays rook c8. Again, black just has to wait around and see if white's going to make any advancement. Knight to e4, threatening maybe something like knight to d6, forking the f7 and c8 rook. Rook c7, and rook to d1. This rook wasn't doing too much, so white slides the rook over here again, preparing to play these pawns forward. But again, we're not in such a rush. Let's keep moving our pieces to better squares here. Black goes ahead and plays king a7. Black has nothing better to do than just march back and forth. And now, white's going to start the advancement. What do you think we should do here? Hope you found the right plan. Here we're going to start with that expansion as we mentioned earlier. c4, d5, and possibly e6 here. Notice that e6 is a bit weak. Problem solve this. How do we get this e6 square underneath control? If you looked at knight c5, not a bad idea. Just be careful. b6 can kick you out of the way, right? We want a more permanent solution. How do we get control over e6? We could move the knight, maybe slide the rook over. But then if we do something like that, this rook will no longer put pressure on the h7 pawn, which means the knight will be let free. Look at your least active piece. Here, the easy plan is to put the king to f5 and then play d5 and then look at playing e6. Notice this king's not doing too much, and because of the placement of the black pieces, well, there's no good way to attack the king anyway, so you might as well put the king to work. In the end game, the king becomes one of the best pieces. King b6, black is just kind of hoping that white plays a bad move like c5 check here, so well the king could get active and maybe even start attacking pawns over here. Well, white's not into any of that. White has their own plans, so let's just go ahead and keep making progress for us. Again, we're not planning to win on the queen side. We're planning to win on the king side in the center by making a passed pawn. King f3, king a7, g4, king b6, king f4, rook g6, and king f5. You can see that now that white has marched the king up, d5, e6 is now part of the plan here. King back. Again, black has nothing better to do than just wait around. And now it's time for white's final breakthrough. d5, pawn takes, and rook to d7. You can see here that black is already ready against this e6 idea by trying to make some trades over here. Now, will this actually be good for him? Probably the best that he can hope for. Again, black has a little bit of pressure on f6 here. Trades here will most likely help him out. He's trying to look for a counter sacrifice here. Notice how white does not even give a hint of any of these kind of ideas to happen. b5 gets played, which is a very interesting move. Black goes ahead and plays a5 and pawn to g5. I really like this move right here as g5. It's going to make this pawn a backwards pawn, which can't be moved forward without being captured by the pawn, but also gives a little bit more defense for the f6 pawn. In some variations where you look at e6, they may look about taking on f6. Now with the pawn defending on two different squares, or after the e pawn move, the g pawn is now defending. This is not even a possibility at all to happen. Again, white just takes it nice and simple here. In endgames, take your time. Again, black is the one who's waiting and trying to figure out something to do. There's no need to relieve the tension in the position. Pawn to a4 gets played. Knight c5. A nice move here, getting a tempo off the rook, but also looking at to help promote this e6 square. Rook c7, and a nice little move here. Check, king takes, knight check, king over, and then knight over. The knight's back to being defended, and also helping this d5 pawn be defended. King goes back to b6, and now for our final breakthrough. Here we go. e6, and rook back to g8. Oof, this is going terrible. For black, rook h4. Of course, rook h4 is an interesting move, looking to go and get some activity over here, and maybe even some checkmate ideas against the black king. If you were thinking in this position to play pawn to e7, slap yourself on the hand. This is not the best. Although this will still be winning here for white, you're allowing black, like I said, that counter chance of sacrificing back. Remember, black is more than happy to give a piece back. Notice here, what happened here? We had such a dominating position, but now we only have 1, 2, 3 pawns and the 2 rooks, which cancel out. Black has the 3 pawns, and the knights cancel out. Now, white is still in a winning position here, but why make your job so hard, right? Here, if we play nice and slow, we can not even allow them the hint of activity to sacrifice back. Here, white plays again, rook h4, looking to become a little bit active and take their time. King goes to c5 here, knight e4 check, king back to b6, and again, we're going to get these rooks active, rook to h3. I love the way that white is playing here, nice and calm, and looking to get these pieces active and kick the king away from the defense of these critical squares over here in the center, where we're going to try and push our pawns across the board. Knight g6 gets played. Rook h to d1. Hopefully you did not fall for the trap of rook takes h7. What does black play here to win back? You got to be diligent. Pawn takes on e6 check, and you just lost your rook. Well, white was a smart player, so he just goes ahead and doubles up the rooks. The h7 pawn will be ours pretty soon enough. Pawn takes, 3 passed pawns here, so beautiful, and ready to queen. Black plays rook to h8. All right, last question for you. What do you play here? What is the final tactical / strategic stroke here for white to make this an easy win here for themselves? This is the top move by the computer. It's quite beautiful. Rook takes on h7. All we need is that pawn, so we can get these 3 passed pawns by themselves. So rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, and king takes. Game over here. There's no good way for black to defend. They can't even try to sacrifice for these guys because their pieces are just not well placed here. The game continued with rook c7, knight to d6. Again, be careful. If you're looking at something like e7 here, you're going to lose another big advantage with just bishop takes on e7, pawn takes, and then rook takes here. White is probably doing okay here, but white take the chance here. All you gotta do is calculate correctly in this position. So white finds the nice stroke of knight to d6, rook c6, and now hopefully you see the last way to the last tactic here to queen the pawn. Very easy. All we do is play e7 here. Pawn takes, rook takes check, king over. Notice it's very important that you calculated that this pawn is actually controlling the rook from coming back to defend. Rook tries to pin it. That's okay. You always have this reserve over here. g6, king over, king f8, threatening to play e8. Of course, if the rook does sacrifice, we're simply going to take back, and this is a very easy endgame to win. Well, I hope you enjoyed this game. Again, if you want to be a good attacker, you must be a very good endgame player. I'll see you in the next game.